In this eye-opening video, we dive deep into the geopolitical realignment taking place around the Ukraine war. While the West portrays Russia as isolated, the reality is far more complex. Russia is receiving military and diplomatic support from key global powers like North Korea, Iran, China, and others across Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Europe. Discover how North Korean missiles and fighter jets, Iranian drones, and economic lifelines from China are reshaping the battlefield. We'll also explore the role of countries like India, Turkey, Vietnam, and even Cuba, where Russian nukes are rumored to be deployed. Meanwhile, the West, limited to verbal condemnations and ineffective sanctions, is exposed as a weakening power on the global stage. This video offers a deep analysis of how the multipolar world is emerging, why Western narratives are failing, and how countries from Africa to Latin America are resisting Western pressure and aligning with Russia. Is the West losing its grip on global influence? Watch the full video to get all the critical insights. Key topics covered: North Korea's military support to Russia, Iranian drone deployment in Ukraine, China's economic and diplomatic backing, global realignment in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the failure of Western sanctions, Western verbal rhetoric versus ground realities, the decline of Western hegemony, and the rise of a multipolar world. Stay informed and get the facts beyond the mainstream narratives. Let's start with today's topic. The war in Ukraine, while initially portrayed as a regional conflict between Russia and Ukraine, has evolved into a global geopolitical chessboard, with alliances forming across continents. Russia, once seen as isolated in its military endeavors, has rallied a broad coalition of nations offering various forms of support, from weapons and technology to diplomatic backing. This emerging alignment includes countries like North Korea, Iran, China, and a range of nations from Africa, Latin America, Asia, and even Europe. Simultaneously, the West, led by the United States and European Union, has been exposed as a weakened force, more capable of loud rhetoric than meaningful action. This narrative is not just one of conflict between Ukraine and Russia, but rather a reflection of a deeper global shift, where the West's influence wanes in favor of a multipolar world. North Korea's active role missiles and fighter jets in Ukraine. A surprising and significant development in the ongoing war has been North Korea's increasing involvement. Often viewed as a pariah state, North Korea's influence in the conflict is expanding through its provision of military hardware to Russia. In recent months, evidence has surfaced showing that North Korean missile technology and fighter jets have been deployed by Russia in its war effort against Ukraine. Missile technology. North Korea's missile program is among the most advanced for a nation of its size and economic standing. By supplying Russia with missiles, North Korea is not only aiding Moscow's military objectives, but also testing its technologies in real-world combat scenarios. This exchange benefits both nations. Russia gains critical military assets, while North Korea gets the opportunity to field test and refine its missile technology. Fighter jets. Reports indicate that North Korean-made fighter jets have been used in combat alongside Russian air forces. This marks a new level of engagement for Pyongyang, which has historically focused on its defense rather than offensive operations outside its borders. The use of North Korean fighters symbolizes the growing strategic military relationship between Russia and North Korea. This collaboration underscores how Russia is not fighting alone, but rather with the support of partners willing to defy international sanctions and the Western narrative of isolation. Iran's drone arsenal in Russian hands. Iran has long been a crucial player in asymmetric warfare, and its drone technology is increasingly proving to be a decisive tool for Russia. As Ukraine struggles to fend off drone attacks on its infrastructure, it is becoming clear that Iran's drones are playing a pivotal role in the conflict. Shahed drones. Iran's Shahed series drones have been widely used by Russian forces to strike Ukrainian military positions, power plants, and civilian infrastructure. These drones are cost-effective, difficult to detect, and capable of causing significant damage, particularly in Ukraine's power grid, plunging much of the country into darkness during winter months. Tactical advantage. The deployment of Iranian drones allows Russia to conserve more expensive, limited stockpiles of missiles while maintaining relentless pressure on Ukrainian defenses. In this regard, Iran has provided Russia with a strategic advantage that few other nations could offer. The involvement of Iran is yet another sign of the growing axis of nations aligning with Russia, challenging the notion that Moscow is isolated on the global stage. China's subtle but strategic support. China, the world's second-largest economy and a burgeoning global superpower, has taken a more nuanced approach in its support for Russia. While not openly providing military assistance, China's economic and diplomatic backing has been critical for Russia's ability to withstand Western sanctions and maintain its war effort. Economic lifeline. Since the onset of the war, China has significantly increased its purchases of Russian energy exports, providing Moscow with a crucial source of revenue as European markets have closed. Furthermore, Chinese companies are reported to have supplied Russia with key dual-use technologies, such as semiconductors, which are vital for modern warfare. Diplomatic support. On the international stage, China has consistently blocked or watered down UN resolutions critical of Russia's actions in Ukraine. This diplomatic shield has been invaluable in preventing the West from gaining broader international consensus against Russia. China's actions suggest a strategic calculation. By supporting Russia, Beijing strengthens its own hand in the global power struggle against the United States and the West. Global realignment, from Africa and Latin America to Vietnam and the Middle East. Beyond North Korea, Iran and China, Russia's alliances extend to a diverse group of nations across the globe. These countries, while not necessarily providing direct military support, are offering diplomatic, economic, and political backing that helps shield Russia from complete isolation. Africa. Many African nations have resisted calls to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, largely due to historical ties from the Soviet era, when Moscow supported anti-colonial movements across the continent. Today, Russia continues to leverage these relationships, offering military aid, energy deals, and economic partnerships in exchange for diplomatic support. Latin America. In Latin America, countries like Cuba and Venezuela have remained staunch allies of Russia. Cuba, in particular, has emerged as a key strategic partner, with reports suggesting that Russian nuclear weapons have been deployed to Cuban soil, reminiscent of Cold War-era tensions. The presence of Russian nukes in Cuba is a direct challenge to the United States, signaling that Russia has the ability to project power far beyond Eastern Europe. Vietnam. Vietnam's relationship with Russia is rooted in decades of military and economic cooperation. While not overtly backing Moscow's actions in Ukraine, Vietnam has refrained from aligning itself with Western sanctions, maintaining its long-standing defense and trade ties with Russia. Middle East. In the Middle East, countries like Syria and Turkey have complicated roles. While Syria has provided unwavering support for Russia, Turkey, a NATO member, has walked a fine line, selling weapons to Ukraine while simultaneously deepening its economic ties with Russia. This balancing act by Turkey highlights the fractured nature of the West's alliances, where even NATO members are not fully aligned. This global realignment points to the emergence of a multipolar world where Western dominance is increasingly challenged. The European divide, Slovakia, Hungary, and Serbia's reluctance. While the European Union has largely been united in its opposition to Russia's actions in Ukraine, certain countries in Eastern Europe have taken a more ambivalent stance, further highlighting the West's fractured position. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has been one of the most vocal critics of the EU's sanctions on Russia, arguing that they do more harm to European economies than to Russia itself. Hungary has maintained strong energy ties with Russia, securing gas deals that undermine the EU's attempts to isolate Moscow economically. Slovakia. In Slovakia, political divisions have emerged over the country's stance on the war, with some factions advocating for a more neutral position, distancing themselves from the West's more aggressive rhetoric and sanctions against Russia. Serbia, a traditional ally of Russia, has refused to join EU sanctions and continues to maintain strong diplomatic and military ties with Moscow. This has further complicated the West's efforts to present a united front in Europe. These divisions within Europe expose the weakness of the West's position, where economic dependencies and political disagreements prevent a truly cohesive response to Russia. Cuba. The return of Russian nukes? One of the most alarming developments in the new global alignment is the reported deployment of Russian nuclear weapons to Cuba. This move has eerie echoes of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, where the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war. Today, the West finds itself in a similarly precarious position, but with far fewer options to respond. Strategic implications. The presence of Russian nuclear weapons in Cuba represents a direct threat to the United States, placing key American cities within striking range. Despite this, the West's response has been largely limited to rhetoric, with little in the way of concrete action to counter this growing threat. West's inability to respond. The deployment of Russian nukes in Cuba highlights the West's declining power. During the Cold War, such a development would have been met with a strong and unified response. Today, however, the West appears unable to do much beyond issuing verbal condemnations, exposing its weakened geopolitical position. The West's decline. Loud rhetoric, little action. As Russia and its allies solidify their positions on the global stage, the West's response has been characterized by loud rhetoric, sanctions, and symbolic gestures. Yet despite their vocal condemnations of Russia, the United States and Europe have been unable to shift the balance of power in Ukraine or on the global stage. Sanctions and their limitations. Western sanctions, while impactful, have not crippled Russia as intended. The reality is that Russia has diversified its economic partnerships, particularly with China and other non-Western nations, blunting the effect of sanctions. Furthermore, these sanctions have caused significant economic pain within Europe, as energy prices have skyrocketed, leading to political instability in several EU countries. Military support for Ukraine. While the West has supplied Ukraine with military aid, this support has been slow and often insufficient. Western governments have hesitated to provide Ukraine with advanced weaponry, fearing escalation with Russia. This caution has limited Ukraine's ability to effectively counter Russia's advances. Propaganda versus reality. The West's media machine has been in full force, painting a picture of Russian isolation and inevitable defeat. However, this narrative does not match the reality on the ground. Russia, bolstered by its allies, remains a formidable force, and Ukraine's battlefield successes have been largely symbolic rather than strategically decisive. The West's shrinking sphere of influence. The war in Ukraine has exposed a stark reality. The West's sphere of influence, once dominant across the globe, is shrinking rapidly. While the United States and its European allies continue to tout their moral and democratic superiority, they are losing ground to a rising coalition of nations who are more aligned with Russia's worldview. This trend is evident not only in the military and diplomatic realms, but also in the economic and cultural spheres. The Western order, built on the back of colonial legacies and the post-World War II international system, is crumbling in the face of a multipolar reality. Economic shifts. The rise of non-Western economies. The West's economic dominance is waning, particularly as nations like China, India, and others in Asia, Africa, and Latin America assert themselves as rising powers. These nations are no longer content to play a subservient role to the United States and Europe. Instead, they are forming new economic alliances that bypass Western financial systems, thereby diluting the power of institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. BRICS, and the rise of alternative trade networks. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, represent a significant challenge to the Western-dominated global financial order. These countries are working to establish alternative payment systems and trading blocs that exclude the US dollar. In 2023, discussions about creating a BRICS currency intensified, signaling the group's intent to undermine the West's control over global trade and finance. Energy independence from the West. The war in Ukraine has been a catalyst for energy realignment. Europe's reliance on Russian gas has forced it to seek alternative sources, but the global energy market has shifted dramatically. Countries like India and China have ramped up their imports of Russian oil and gas, securing energy supplies at discounted rates, while the West faces skyrocketing energy costs. Meanwhile, African and Middle Eastern nations are increasingly looking eastward for energy partnerships, further marginalizing the West in the global energy market. The Silk Road Revival, China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, is another critical factor in the economic realignment. Through this ambitious infrastructure project, China is connecting Asia, Europe, and Africa through a vast network of trade routes. Russia is a key partner in this initiative, providing a land bridge to Europe and access to vital resources. The BRI represents a significant shift away from Western-controlled global trade routes, empowering nations that have long been sidelined by the US-European economic hegemony. Beyond the economic and military spheres, there is a growing ideological and cultural resistance to Western values and norms. Nations across the world are increasingly rejecting the Western model of liberal democracy and capitalist-driven globalization, opting instead for governance systems that reflect their own values, traditions, and histories. This ideological shift is perhaps most pronounced in the Global South, where Western interventions and impositions have often led to instability and conflict. The failure of Western democracy promotion. The United States and Europe have long championed the idea of spreading democracy and human rights as the cornerstone of their foreign policy. However, this agenda has often been seen as hypocritical, particularly when it is used to justify military interventions or economic sanctions. Countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, having suffered from Western-backed coups, regime changes, and economic interference, are increasingly skeptical of Western democracy promotion. Many are turning to alternative models, such as the state capitalism practiced by China or the strongman governance seen in Russia. Media and propaganda wars. The West has historically dominated the global narrative through its control of major media outlets such as CNN, BBC, and other Western news conglomerates. However, the rise of alternative media platforms, particularly from Russia, RT, and China, CGTN, has allowed non-Western nations to challenge the Western monopoly on information. This media war has shown that Western narratives about global events, including the war in Ukraine, are not as universally accepted as they once were. In many parts of the world, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Western media is seen as biased and out of touch with local realities. One of the most glaring aspects of the Ukraine conflict has been the disparity between the West's rhetoric and its actions. While Western leaders frequently condemn Russia, announce sanctions, and hold press conferences touting their support for Ukraine, these efforts have proven insufficient in altering the course of the war or in deterring Russia's broader strategic ambitions. Sanctions that backfire. Western sanctions, intended to cripple Russia's economy, have had mixed results at best. Russia has managed to adapt by deepening its trade relationships with China, India, and other non-Western countries. The Russian economy, while facing challenges, has not collapsed as many in the West had predicted. Instead, Europe has borne the brunt of these sanctions, with energy prices soaring and inflation rising to levels not seen in decades. Western sanctions have inadvertently strengthened Russia's ties with the Global South, where many nations see these measures as another form of Western imperialism. Military aid with strings attached. The military aid provided to Ukraine has been substantial, yet it has come with significant limitations. The West has been cautious not to escalate the conflict by providing advanced offensive weapons that could lead to direct confrontation with Russia. This cautious approach, while understandable from a strategic perspective, has severely limited Ukraine's ability to reclaim lost territory or decisively defeat Russian forces. Meanwhile, Russia continues to receive military support from its allies, including North Korea and Iran, without the same constraints. NATO's hollow threats. Despite frequent NATO declarations of unity and strength, the alliance has been hesitant to engage directly in the Ukraine conflict. The fear of a broader war with a nuclear-armed Russia has paralyzed NATO's ability to act decisively. Instead, NATO has been content with verbal condemnations and symbolic gestures, leaving Ukraine to bear the brunt of the fighting. This hesitation has revealed NATO's limitations as a defensive alliance, particularly when facing a determined adversary like Russia. For decades, the West has relied on its cultural and media dominance to shape global opinion. From Hollywood films to CNN's global news reach, Western narratives have been a powerful tool in shaping the perception of conflicts and geopolitical events. However, in the case of Ukraine, this propaganda machine has faltered. Diverging global opinions. While Western media portrays Russia as a pariah and Ukraine as a heroic defender of democracy, this narrative is not universally accepted. In much of the global South, the Ukraine conflict is seen through a different lens, one that recognizes the West's long history of interventionism, double standards, and disregard for non-Western nations' sovereignty. Russia, for many, is viewed not as an aggressor, but as a counterbalance to Western imperialism. Information warfare. Russia, China, and other non-Western powers have developed sophisticated information warfare capabilities, effectively challenging the West's media dominance. Russian state media, particularly RT and Sputnik, have successfully countered Western narratives by highlighting the hypocrisies and failures of US foreign policy. These platforms have found a receptive audience in countries that have grown weary of Western lectures on democracy and human rights. The rise of multipolar media. In the era of social media and decentralized information, the West can no longer control the global narrative. Platforms like YouTube, Telegram, and Twitter, now X, have become battlegrounds for competing viewpoints, with many non-Western voices finding a platform to challenge Western media dominance. This democratization of information has made it far more difficult for the West to unilaterally shape global opinion. While the West, particularly the United States, remains the world's largest military power, its ability to project power effectively is waning. The war in Ukraine has exposed significant weaknesses in Western military and diplomatic strategy. Overstretch and resource depletion. The US military, having been involved in continuous conflicts since the early 2000s, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, is stretched thin. Meanwhile, European NATO members have long underinvested in their own defense, relying on the US security umbrella. The war in Ukraine has put additional strain on already overextended Western military resources. Supply chains for weapons, ammunition, and advanced military technologies are under pressure, with production timelines often too slow to meet Ukraine's needs. Diplomatic isolation. Despite its efforts to rally the international community, the West has found itself increasingly isolated diplomatically. The refusal of key global powers such as China and India to join Western sanctions against Russia, coupled with the ambivalence of countries in the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, has undermined Western diplomatic efforts. Russia, meanwhile, has successfully cultivated a wide network of alliances that stretch from North Korea and Iran to African nations and beyond, ensuring it is not diplomatically isolated. The war in Ukraine is, in many ways, a symptom of the broader decline of Western hegemony. While the West remains powerful, its grip on global affairs is loosening, and its ability to unilaterally shape the future is fading. Russia, China, Iran, and other nations are challenging the West's dominance on multiple fronts, militarily, economically, diplomatically, and ideologically. A multipolar world emerges. The era of Western unipolarity, which followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, is over. We are now living in a multipolar world where no single power or bloc can dictate terms to the rest of the globe. Russia's war in Ukraine, supported by a broad coalition of nations from North Korea to Iran, China and beyond, underscores this reality. As the war rages on, it reveals a tectonic shift in global power structures, signaling the end of Western dominance. Russia is not alone in its struggle against Ukraine, backed by the West. The coalition of nations providing both direct and indirect support to Russia includes a diverse array of countries with varying motives, but all united by their shared opposition to Western hegemony. North Korea's military assistance to Russia, ranging from fighter jets to advanced missile systems, is a clear statement of defiance against international sanctions and the US-led global order. While North Korea is often portrayed as a rogue state, its role in supporting Russia signals its desire to be part of a larger bloc challenging the West. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's increasing military cooperation with Russia, including arms deals and defense pacts, signifies that Pyongyang is no longer a passive player on the global stage. Iran, emboldened by its regional influence and revolutionary ideology, sees its partnership with Russia as part of a broader resistance to Western domination. The provision of drones and other military technologies to Russia is not just a transactional relationship. It reflects Iran's long-term strategy to weaken US influence in the Middle East and beyond. By helping Russia, Iran secures its own strategic goals, gaining leverage in its ongoing conflicts with Western-backed Gulf nations and Israel. While China has been more restrained in its open support for Russia, its economic and diplomatic backing has been crucial. China's long-term interests lie in reshaping global governance to reflect its rise as a superpower. By aligning itself with Russia, China subtly undermines Western-led institutions, from the United Nations to the World Trade Organization. China's role as a diplomatic shield, preventing stronger international action against Russia, is part of its broader goal to weaken US influence globally. India's strategic neutrality. India, while maintaining a cautious neutrality in the conflict, has increased its economic engagement with Russia. New Delhi's refusal to join Western sanctions has been driven by its strategic interest in maintaining affordable energy supplies from Russia and balancing its relationships with both the United States and Russia. India's stance illustrates the broader trend of countries refusing to choose sides in the West versus Russia dichotomy, opting instead to pursue their own national interests. Turkey's balancing act. A NATO member and a key regional power, Turkey has played both sides in the conflict. While supplying Ukraine with drones and other military equipment, Turkey has simultaneously deepened its economic ties with Russia, benefiting from the geopolitical vacuum created by the West's focus on Ukraine. Turkey's pragmatism exposes the cracks within NATO and highlights how Western alliances are no longer as unified as they once were. African nations' defiance. Many African countries, long wary of Western interventions, have been reluctant to side with the United States and Europe in condemning Russia. Nations like South Africa, which has historical ties with Russia dating back to the anti-apartheid struggle, view Russia as a counterbalance to Western dominance. Russia, in turn, has capitalized on these sentiments by offering military and economic partnerships to African nations, further undermining the West's influence on the continent. Latin American resistance. In Latin America, countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba have openly supported Russia, while others like Brazil have maintained a neutral stance. Russia's presence in Cuba, including reports of nuclear deployment, harks back to Cold War-era strategies aimed at pressuring the United States. The survival of leftist governments in Latin America, often antagonistic toward US foreign policy, ensures that Russia has enduring allies in the Western Hemisphere. Western hypocrisy, the double standards of US foreign policy. One of the key reasons for the West's declining influence is the perception of hypocrisy in its foreign policy. The West, particularly the US, has positioned itself as the defender of democracy and human rights, but its actions often contradict these values. Selective intervention. The US and its NATO allies have a long history of selective military interventions, often justified on humanitarian grounds, but frequently driven by geopolitical interests. From the invasion of Iraq under false pretenses to the bombing of Libya, Western interventions have destabilized entire regions, creating power vacuums that led to further conflict. These actions undermine the West's credibility when it condemns Russia's invasion of Ukraine as an illegal act of aggression. Human rights abuses. The West frequently criticizes countries like Russia and China for their human rights records, yet it has supported regimes that commit similar abuses. The US has long been an ally of Saudi Arabia, despite its involvement in the devastating war in Yemen and its human rights violations. This double standard weakens the moral authority of the West, making its criticism of Russia's actions in Ukraine seem disingenuous. Economic coercion. Western sanctions, often portrayed as a peaceful alternative to military action, have a long history of harming civilian populations without achieving their intended political outcomes. In countries like Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba, sanctions have led to widespread poverty and suffering, while the targeted regimes remain in power. The use of economic coercion by the West is seen by many as an extension of its imperial past, where financial domination replaces direct military control. The propaganda war challenging Western narratives. One of the most significant shifts in the global response to the Ukraine conflict has been the challenge to Western media narratives. The West has long dominated the global flow of information, with major news outlets like CNN, BBC, and the New York Times shaping international perspectives. However, this dominance is being eroded by alternative media sources and the rise of state-controlled media from Russia, China, and others. Russian media influence. Russian state-controlled media, particularly RT and Sputnik, have played a crucial role in countering Western narratives about the Ukraine conflict. By offering alternative viewpoints, these outlets have gained significant audiences in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, regions where skepticism of Western media is high. Russian media portray the war as a defensive action against NATO encroachment, framing the conflict as part of a broader struggle against Western imperialism. Chinese media strategy. China's global media strategy, led by outlets like CGTN, has also played a part in shaping perceptions of the Ukraine war. By emphasizing multipolarity and non-interference, Chinese media outlets appeal to countries that have grown tired of Western interventionism. China's approach has been to avoid taking sides overtly while highlighting the West's failures in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, drawing attention to the consequences of Western-led wars. The role of social media. In addition to state-controlled media, social media platforms have become a battleground for competing narratives. Platforms like Telegram, used by both Ukrainian and Russian forces to share battlefield updates, have allowed both sides to bypass traditional media and communicate directly with global audiences. This decentralization of information has made it harder for the West to maintain a unified narrative, as alternative voices and viewpoints gain traction in the online space. The most glaring weakness in the West's response to the Ukraine war has been the discrepancy between its loud rhetoric and the realities on the ground. Western leaders have made bold statements about supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, but their actions have often fallen short of these promises. Hollow military support. While the West has provided Ukraine with military aid, it has been hesitant to supply the kinds of advanced weapon systems that could significantly alter the course of the war. Fears of escalation with Russia have limited the types of arms sent to Ukraine, resulting in a piecemeal approach that has done little to shift the balance of power decisively. Diplomatic failures. Diplomatic efforts by the West to isolate Russia have been met with mixed success. While the US and Europe have rallied their allies in NATO and the EU, they have failed to secure broad international support for their sanctions and diplomatic measures. Key global powers like China, India, and Brazil have refused to join the Western-led efforts, leaving Russia with significant international backing. Economic shortcomings. The sanctions regime imposed on Russia has also had unintended consequences. While the West hoped to cripple the Russian economy, Russia has adapted by redirecting its trade to non-Western markets. Meanwhile, Europe has faced significant economic challenges as a result of its own sanctions, particularly in the energy sector, where dependence on Russian gas has led to skyrocketing prices and political instability. The war in Ukraine has exposed the limits of Western power in a rapidly changing world. The West's ability to project influence, both militarily and economically, is being challenged by a new coalition of countries that are no longer willing to accept Western dominance. The rise of regional powers. Countries like China, India, Turkey, and Iran are asserting themselves as regional powers with global ambitions. These nations, while not always aligned with Russia on every issue, share a common goal of weakening Western influence. The emergence of these regional powers marks the end of the unipolar world that followed the Cold War, where the US and its allies dictated the terms of global governance. A new global order. The world is moving toward a multipolar global order, where power is distributed among several major players rather than concentrated in the West. This new order is characterized by regional alliances, economic decoupling from the US dollar, and a rejection of Western-led institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Russia, despite facing significant challenges, is playing a key role in this transformation, acting as both a military power and a geopolitical catalyst for the rise of new alliances against the West. Russia's war in Ukraine, far from isolating the country, has pushed it to the forefront of the global movement against Western hegemony. Moscow's alliances with countries like China, India, North Korea, and Iran illustrate a broader realignment of global power. These partnerships, combined with the support of nations across Africa, Latin America, and parts of Europe, signal that the West's influence is no longer unrivaled. Military strength and influence. Despite facing stiff resistance in Ukraine and heavy economic sanctions, Russia's military remains formidable. It has showcased its ability to project power beyond its borders, with its use of proxy forces, sophisticated missile systems, and advanced drone technologies acquired from allies like Iran. North Korea's involvement only adds another layer to Russia's military strength, showing that Moscow is not alone in its fight against Ukraine, and by extension, NATO. Economic adaptation. While the West sought to cripple Russia's economy, Moscow has instead reoriented its trade towards Asia and the global South. China and India's purchases of Russian oil, natural gas, and wheat have provided Russia with a lifeline, helping it weather the storm of sanctions. Russia is also increasingly trading in non-dollar currencies, undermining the West's financial dominance and promoting the idea of a multipolar world order where the US dollar is not the sole global currency. Political and ideological leadership. Russia's defiance of the West has inspired many countries that have felt marginalized or bullied by US foreign policy. From Latin America to Africa, many nations see Russia as a symbol of resistance to Western neo-imperialism. This alignment is not just military or economic, it is also deeply ideological. For countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and Syria, Russia represents a counterweight to decades of US interventionism, regime change, and economic exploitation. As Russia strengthens its alliances and challenges Western influence, internal divisions within the West have become increasingly apparent. Europe, once united under NATO and the EU, is now grappling with disagreements over the war in Ukraine, energy policies, and how to handle Russia. Europe's energy crisis. The West's sanctions on Russian energy have backfired, particularly in Europe. Many European nations, particularly Germany, Italy, and Hungary, have been heavily reliant on Russian gas. The sanctions, while intended to punish Russia, have instead led to skyrocketing energy prices in Europe, forcing governments to impose austerity measures and triggering widespread protests. Countries like Hungary have openly criticized EU sanctions, calling them counterproductive and harmful to European economies. NATO's fractures. Although NATO has presented a united front in support of Ukraine, there are clear fractures within the alliance. Turkey's balancing act, selling drones to Ukraine while maintaining strong economic ties with Russia, exemplifies the strategic dilemmas facing many NATO members. Additionally, countries like Slovakia and Hungary have expressed skepticism about fully aligning with the West's hardline stance against Russia, further complicating NATO's cohesion. The US and Europe's waning influence. In the broader geopolitical landscape, the US and Europe are struggling to maintain their influence. The West's inability to secure broader international support for its sanctions against Russia highlights the decline of its global leadership. Countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America have either remained neutral or openly sided with Russia, refusing to follow the Western narrative. This is particularly evident in the UN, where attempts to isolate Russia diplomatically have met with limited success. The West's propaganda machine fails to control the narrative. Another major challenge for the West has been the failure of its propaganda machine to control the global narrative. While Western media outlets like CNN, BBC, and the New York Times continue to dominate in Europe and the United States, their influence is waning in the global South. Alternative media's rise. Russia's RT and China's CGTN have gained significant traction in countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, offering alternative perspectives to Western media. These outlets have painted a different picture of the war in Ukraine, portraying it not as a simple case of Russian aggression, but as part of a broader struggle against Western imperialism and NATO expansion. Social media's decentralization of information. The rise of social media has also played a critical role in undermining Western propaganda. Platforms like Telegram, Twitter, now X, and YouTube have allowed both Russian and Ukrainian perspectives to reach global audiences directly. This decentralization of information has made it harder for the West to maintain a monopoly on the narrative, as users can access a diverse range of viewpoints outside of the traditional media ecosystem. Skepticism of Western narratives. In much of the global South, there is growing skepticism of Western narratives, particularly in light of the West's own history of military interventions and human rights abuses. Countries that have experienced US and European interference, whether through military coups, economic sanctions, or political destabilization, are less inclined to view Russia as the sole aggressor in the conflict. Instead, many see the war as a proxy battle between Russia and NATO, with Ukraine caught in the middle. The West's limited response, loud words, little action. The most glaring weakness in the West's strategy has been the gap between its rhetoric and its actions. Despite issuing strong condemnations of Russia, imposing sanctions, and sending military aid to Ukraine, the West has failed to meaningfully alter the trajectory of the war or weaken Russia's position globally. Ineffective sanctions. The sanctions imposed on Russia have not had the crippling effect that Western leaders predicted. Instead, Russia has found alternative markets for its energy and commodities, particularly in Asia. China, India, and Turkey have all increased their imports of Russian oil and gas, allowing Moscow to continue funding its war effort. Meanwhile, Europe has borne the brunt of the sanctions, with rising inflation, energy shortages, and political instability in countries like Germany and Italy. Military aid with strings attached. The military aid provided to Ukraine has been significant, but it has often come with strings attached. Western governments have been reluctant to supply Ukraine with advanced long-range missiles or fighter jets, fearing that such weapons could provoke a direct conflict with Russia. This cautious approach has limited Ukraine's ability to push back Russian forces and regain lost territory. Diplomatic weakness. Diplomatically, the West has struggled to build a global coalition against Russia. While the US and Europe have succeeded in rallying NATO and the EU, they have failed to convince key players in the global South, such as India, Brazil, and South Africa, to join their efforts. The West's reliance on sanctions and military aid has proven ineffective in persuading these countries to abandon their neutral or pro-Russian stances. The emergence of a multipolar world order. The war in Ukraine, combined with the broader geopolitical shifts of recent years, has accelerated the decline of Western hegemony and the rise of a multipolar world order. In this new era, power is no longer concentrated in the hands of the US and its European allies, but is instead distributed across multiple regional powers and blocs. BRICS and the new global economy. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are at the forefront of this new multipolar world order. Together, these countries represent a significant share of the global economy and are working to establish alternative financial systems that bypass the US dollar. The recent discussions about creating a BRICS currency reflect the group's desire to reduce dependence on Western financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank. Regional powers rise. In addition to the BRICS, regional powers like Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia are asserting themselves as key players in the global arena. These countries are increasingly charting their own foreign policies, independent of Western influence. Turkey's balancing act between NATO and Russia, Iran's defiance of US sanctions, and Saudi Arabia's pivot towards China all signal a broader trend of regional powers pursuing their own interests in a multipolar world. The decline of Western institutions. The institutions that have long underpinned the Western-led global order, such as the United Nations, NATO, and the World Bank, are increasingly seen as out of touch with the realities of a multipolar world. As more countries seek to create alternative structures, the West's influence over global governance is waning. Conclusion. The West's diminishing role in a changing world. The war in Ukraine has exposed the West's declining power and the rise of a multipolar global order. While the US and Europe continue to issue loud condemnations and impose sanctions, their ability to shape global events is weakening. Russia, supported by a diverse coalition of countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, has demonstrated that the West is no longer the unchallenged arbiter of international affairs. The emergence of new alliances, the rise of alternative economic systems, and the global pushback against Western hypocrisy have all contributed to the West's diminished role on the world stage. In this new multipolar world, the West can no longer rely on its historical dominance to dictate terms to the rest of the globe. Instead, it must adapt to a reality where power is shared among multiple actors, each with their own interests and visions for the future. As the war in Ukraine continues, it serves as a symbol of this broader shift, a shift that marks the end of Western unipolarity and the dawn of a multipolar era where the West's loud rhetoric is no longer enough to dictate global outcomes. In this new reality, the West must contend with a world where its influence is diluted, its alliances fractured, and its power challenged by nations that reject its dominance. As multipolarity takes hold, the era of Western hegemony fades, and no amount of verbal posturing or propaganda can reverse the tide of change. The Ukraine conflict, far from isolating Russia, has catalyzed a global realignment, underscoring the West's shrinking role in a world it can no longer control.